Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey back in time, not to a glorious knightly battle or a grand royal court, but into the quiet, often brutal, daily life of medieval women. Imagine you're standing in a cramped, smoky hovel, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. A tallow candle flickers, casting long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Outside, the wind howls a mournful tune, rattling the single, small window. You can hear the distant bleating of a few sheep and the lowing of a cow. Sounds that signify not comfort, but your next meal, if you're lucky. In this world, the very first moments of your life are a gamble. And for a girl, the stakes are even higher. You see, being born was less a joyous occasion and more a roll of the dice in a game you probably won't survive. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The very first test you face, as a tiny, helpless creature entering this world, is simply to draw a breath and stay alive. And as a girl, that test is particularly cruel. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was not a sanitized, serene affair. It was a terrifying, communal event shrouded in superstition and the grim reality of high mortality rates. You are born, probably in a bed straw-filled and unsanitary, surrounded by local women, a midwife, a few neighbors, who rely on a combination of folklore, prayer, and primitive know-how. The midwife, often an elderly woman with no formal training, is your only hope. She might offer you a charm to wear, like a piece of coral or a sliver of jet, or perhaps she'll recite an incantation passed down through generations. Mainstream historical fact time. A woman's chance of dying during or after childbirth in the medieval era was estimated to be somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 3. A statistic that makes modern birth rates look like a stroll through a flower garden. And that's just the mother. The infant mortality rate was staggering. 2. Up to half of all babies born did not live to see their first birthday. But for a girl, the risks don't end there. There's a curious tidbit of history that shows how differently girls and boys were valued from the moment they were born. In some regions, if a male child was born, the parents might receive a small gift or a reduction in their taxes from the local lord. As a healthy male heir was seen as an asset. For a girl, nothing. In fact, a girl was often considered a financial burden, a mouth to feed who would one day need a dowry to be married off. The dowry was a crucial part of the marriage transaction, a topic we'll get to soon. But for now, just know that your life, from the very beginning, is a balance sheet. You are a debt, an expenditure, and your family's investment in you is not for your own sake, but for a future transactional benefit. Historians still argue whether this dowry system, a practice common across much of Europe, was a form of protection for women or simply a way to sell them off to the highest bidder. It's one of those debates where the answer probably lies somewhere uncomfortably in the middle. So, you, a newborn girl, have survived the first test. Your tiny lungs have filled with air, and you've let out a cry that announces your existence. If not your value, your mother, if she survived, is weak, and the rest of the women are exhausted. They might offer a prayer to a saint, maybe Saint Margaret of Antioch, the patron saint of childbirth, or perhaps they'll simply offer thanks that the worst is over. But the shadow of infant death looms large over the cradle. If you fall ill, the remedies available are, let's just say they're more likely to earn you a spot on a medical history podcast than cure you. A poultice of herbs, a prayer, perhaps a bit of diluted wine for a fever. No vaccines, no antibiotics, no pediatrician on speed dial. Just a lot of hope and a healthy dose of fatalism. The best chance you have is a strong constitution and a lot of luck. And so your life begins. Not with a fanfare, but with a quiet, precarious, and thoroughly brutal introduction to a world that has already decided your worth based on your gender. You've survived infancy, a small miracle in itself. Now, as a young girl, your life isn't marked by playdates and school bells. It's a relentless apprenticeship in the hard realities of medieval existence. From the moment you can walk and grasp a small object, you are put to work. There's no formal education, no cozy classrooms with slate and chalk. Instead, your classroom is the hearth, the kitchen garden, the spinning wheel, and the water well. Your teachers are your mother and the other women of the household. Their lessons taught through demonstration and immediate, bone-deep physical toil. You learn by doing, and you do it all day. Every day. It's not about being a kid, it's about being a small, unpaid laborer. Your hands, so small and soft now, will soon become calloused and rough. You might start by fetching small sticks for the fire, then progress to carrying water from the stream. A surprisingly heavy and difficult task that you have to do regardless of the weather. Maybe you're tasked with tending to the chickens or helping to weed the garden, picking out the endless nettles and thistles that seem to grow faster than the vegetables. By the time you're 10, your work will be indistinguishable from that of an adult. You're spinning wool into thread, a repetitive motion that can make your fingers ache and cramp. You're grinding grain with a heavy stone quern, an activity so mundane and physical that it becomes a kind of meditative torture. Mainstream historical fact. While sons might learn a trade from their fathers, daughters were universally trained in the domestic arts, spinning, weaving, cooking, brewing, and preserving, skills that were considered essential for a woman's survival and her future value as a wife. A quirky historical tidbit from this era is the use of pottage, a thick stew made of whatever was available, grains, vegetables, and sometimes meat. It was the staple of the peasant diet. And as a young girl, a large part of your life would revolve around its preparation. The fun part? Pottage was rarely, if ever, thrown away. The last of one day's batch would be used as the base for the next day's. A continuous, never-ending concoction. The same pot, scraping off the bottom layers, adding fresh ingredients, then repeating, sometimes for weeks on end. You could say it was the original, set it and forget it. But with more chance of food poisoning. I imagine it gave it a, let's call it a, complex flavor profile. This lack of formal education wasn't just about the absence of books, it was a deliberate societal choice. A girl's future was in the home, not in the monastery or the scribal school. Learning to read and write was a rare and precious skill, reserved almost exclusively for men in religious orders or for the very highest echelons of nobility. For you, the most important knowledge is how to manage a household, raise children, and contribute to the family's economic survival. Your life is a physical and domestic one. You don't read poetry, you mend a torn tunic. You don't study arithmetic, you count chickens and measure out grain. Historians still argue whether this exclusion from literacy was more about maintaining social hierarchy or a pragmatic response to the realities of a demanding, non-scholarly life. It's hard to say which came first. Did they not educate you because you were seen as a domestic being? Or did your life remain domestic because you weren't educated? A classic chicken and the egg situation, only with a lot more dirt and less intellectual freedom. Your games, if you have any time for them, are simple and often mimic the labor you are learning. You might fashion dolls out of old rags or play with sticks and pebbles. There's no room for imaginative escape, because every waking hour is about contribution. The world you inhabit is small and circumscribed. The village, the fields, the forest's edge, that is your universe. And in this universe, your value is not in who you are, but in what you can do. From a very young age, your body is a tool, and your life is a long, slow grind. The grind of your childhood quickly gives way to a new, monumental phase of your life, marriage. It's not the romantic, white dress affair we think of today. You don't get to choose your partner. You don't fall in love. And you certainly don't date. Instead, your marriage is a cold, hard business transaction, a deal brokered between two families. Think of it less as a wedding and more as a merger. And you are the key asset being traded. For your family, a marriage is a way to gain land, secure alliances, or move up a social rung. For the groom's family, it's about acquiring more land, more labor, and, most importantly, the ability to produce heirs. The dowry, remember that? It's not a fun party favor. It's the financial payment your family gives to your husband's family to seal the deal. This could be anything from a piece of land to a few cows, a chest of linens, or a sum of money. The size of the dowry is a direct reflection of your family's wealth and, by extension, your own perceived value. Without a decent dowry, your options for a husband are severely limited. You're a commodity, and this is the price tag. Mainstream historical fact. The practice of the dowry was deeply ingrained in medieval European society. serving to both solidify legal agreements and provide a woman with a small amount of personal property she could, in theory, fall back on if she were to become a widow. But it's not all bad, right? Well, a quirky tidbit is the concept of bride price. In some cultures and at different times, the reverse was true, where the groom's family paid a bride price to the bride's family. This could be a symbol of the bride's value as a future mother and worker. However, the dowry system became dominant across most of Western Europe, placing the financial burden squarely on the bride's side. So, you're not just marrying a man, you're marrying his family, his land, and his social standing. Your new identity is completely absorbed into his. Your legal personhood, what little you had, essentially ceases to exist in its own right. You become a legal extension of your husband, a concept known as coverture. Historians still argue whether this system was more about male control or a practical necessity for property consolidation in an agrarian society. Was it designed to keep women in their place? Or was it a logical, if brutal, system for keeping family holdings intact in an era of constant instability? The answer, as is often the case, is probably a bit of both. Your new home might be a few miles away, or it could be in a village you've never seen, far from your family and friends. You are leaving everything you've ever known to join a new household, where you are a stranger, an outsider. The only thing you can do is work hard and try to prove your worth as a wife and future mother. Your new life is defined by your husband's status. If he's a peasant, your days will be filled with backbreaking work in the fields and the home. If he's a nobleman, you'll be managing a large household, overseeing servants, and raising children in a world of political intrigue and social rules. But no matter your social class, your primary duty remains the same, to produce a male heir. A failed pregnancy or the birth of only daughters is not just a disappointment, it could be a catastrophe for the family line and a point of serious friction in your marriage. Your body, from childhood, was not truly your own. It was, and remains, a vessel for the continuation of your family's lineage. And now, your husband's. So, your wedding night isn't about passion, it's about production. It's the moment you begin the long, often dangerous, work of fulfilling your purpose. Now that you're married, the long, grueling work of daily domesticity begins in earnest. This isn't the kind of domestic life you see in romantic movies. Your home isn't a cozy retreat, it's a site of constant, physically demanding labor. You wake before dawn, often to the cold air seeping through the cracks in the walls. And your work doesn't end until you fall, exhausted, into a bed of straw. Your hands are never idle. They are constantly kneading bread, scrubbing clothes, or repairing torn garments. A huge part of your day is dedicated to food. You're not just cooking, you're processing food from its most basic state. There are no grocery stores. You might spend hours a day grinding grain into flour with a heavy stone quern. The repetitive motion, a dull ache in your arms. You're baking bread in a communal oven or your own small hearth. A delicate balance of fire and timing. You're salting meat and fish to preserve it. A pungent and messy task. You're gathering herbs for medicine and flavor. And you're milking the cow or goat. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval women were responsible for the vast majority of food processing and preparation. And this included not just cooking but also the laborious tasks of brewing ale and making cheese, which were critical sources of both calories and income for many households. There's a quirky little detail about medieval housekeeping that just shows you how different their world was. To get a fire going, you might not use a match, because those didn't exist. Instead, you'd use a tinderbox, a small container with a flint, steel, and tinder, a charred cloth or fungus. The task of striking the flint to create a spark was often a job for the women and children of the house. I can only imagine how many times you'd smack your thumb with a rock before you got it right. If you were really lucky, you had a fire that never went out, so you didn't have to bother. Keeping that ember alive was a constant, low-level anxiety. The cleaning isn't a quick spray and wipe. It's a full-body workout. You're sweeping a dirt floor with a broom made of twigs. A Sisyphean task. Washing clothes involves carrying them to a stream, or a large basin, and scrubbing them with lye soap, a harsh chemical that probably makes your hands crack and bleed, and then beating them with a washing bat. There are no washing machines, no dryers, no detergents, just your raw physical strength against the dirt. Historians still argue whether the division of labor between men and women was an efficient, pragmatic system for survival or a patriarchal structure designed to keep women in a subordinate role, with their work devalued as unskilled domestic labor. The answer, as you might guess, depends on whether you were the one swinging the heavy stone quern or the one watching. Remember the pottage? You're still making that, and on top of it all, you're also responsible for mending and making the family's clothes. This means everything from carding and spinning wool, to weaving it into cloth, to cutting and sewing the garments by hand. Every stitch, every thread, is the result of your labor. The very shirt on your husband's back is your handiwork. There's no easy fix. Every tear means more mending. Every stain a longer scrub. This isn't a life of leisure or choice. It's a life of endless, repetitive, and often invisible servitude. Your back aches, your fingers are raw, and your exhaustion is a constant companion. And you're doing it all while probably pregnant or nursing, with another baby crying in the corner. You are the engine of the household, a one-woman show that keeps the family alive, fed, and clothed, a cycle that will only end when you are no longer able to work. In a world defined by birthright and brute force, your path to power, as a woman, is incredibly narrow, a treacherous trail with very few turn-offs. Unlike men, who could become a knight, a priest, or a merchant, your social mobility is tied almost entirely to the men in your life, your father and then your husband. You can't simply start a business or join a guild on your own. Your destiny is not your own to shape, it's a role assigned to you at birth. The social ladder for women had very few rungs, and most were either married off to a higher social class or remained within their own. For the vast majority, the peasant woman's life was the one you were born into and the one you would die in. But even in this rigid system, there were a few, rare, and often difficult paths to a different kind of life. For example, some women found a form of freedom and influence in the convent. By taking religious vows, you could escape the cycle of childbirth and domestic servitude. This wasn't a choice for everyone, of course, as it often required a significant dowry to enter a respectable nunnery. But for those who did, it offered a chance to learn to read and write, to study, and to hold a position of authority, sometimes as an abbess who managed vast lands and commanded respect from powerful men. Mainstream historical fact: abbeys and convents were one of the few places in medieval Europe where women could receive a formal education and exercise real administrative and economic power. A quirky detail is that some women, especially in towns and cities, were able to participate in guilds, which were the professional associations for craftsmen and merchants. These were often family businesses, and the wife was expected to be a skilled partner. In some rare cases, a widow could even take over her husband's guild membership and run the business herself. This was not a common path, and it was often fraught with legal challenges. But it did exist, so while a life of work was a given, there were a few fleeting moments where you could exert a degree of independence. Of course, a lot of the work done by women was not seen as skilled labor, even though it was incredibly hard and essential, so they were often excluded from the very guilds that protected male workers. Historians still argue whether the existence of these limited opportunities for women, like joining a convent or taking over a husband's business, were evidence of a more fluid, less patriarchal society than we assume, or if they were simply exceptions that proved the rule of widespread female subordination. It's a good question. Were these small freedoms a sign of hope, or just a cruel reminder of how little control you had over your own life? The very fact that these paths were so rare and so dependent on either religious piety or the misfortune of losing your husband suggests that they were more the exception than the rule. So, while the men around you might dream of becoming a knight or a wealthy merchant, your dreams are probably much smaller and more immediate: surviving childbirth, keeping your children healthy, and making sure there's enough food to last through the winter. Power for you isn't about commanding an army or owning a castle. It's about the quiet, invisible power of keeping a family alive. It's about a well-stocked larder, a healthy child, and the small, personal authority you hold over your own hearth and home. The world might not see you, but you are the foundation upon which everything else is built. As a medieval woman, your legal existence is a hazy, subordinate thing, less a person in your own right and more a piece of property. The law, as it existed, was written by men, for men, and your place within it was defined by your relationship to a man. Before you were married, you were under the legal authority of your father. Once you married, that authority transferred directly to your husband. This legal doctrine was known as coverture, and it meant that, for all practical purposes, your legal identity was subsumed by your husband's. You couldn't own property in your own name, make a contract, or even sue someone in court without your husband's consent. Think of it as a permanent, legally binding, one-sided partnership where you had all the duties and none of the rights. Mainstream historical fact: under coverture, a married woman could not represent herself in court and had no control over any property she brought into the marriage. Her legal standing was entirely dependent on her husband. There's a quirky little detail about this system that shows just how thorough it was. Your legal status wasn't just about property. In some places, a woman's testimony in court was considered less reliable than a man's, and her word could be dismissed more easily. I can only imagine what it would be like to stand in a courtroom, trying to make a case, and knowing that your very voice was seen as inherently less trustworthy. It's like being in a game where the rules are rigged against you from the start. On the flip side, some historians argue that while this system was designed to control women, it also provided them with a certain kind of protection. Your husband was legally obligated to support and protect you, and his property was, in a sense, your security. Of course, that's a bit like saying a gilded cage is a form of protection. Historians still argue whether this legal status was more about paternalistic protection or simply a tool for male domination. Were men genuinely trying to protect their wives in a dangerous world? Or were they simply ensuring that all wealth and power remained in male hands? It's a good question, and the answer likely lies in the vast gray area between those two extremes. Even a noblewoman, a woman of great wealth and status, was still bound by this system. Her dowry and her property were controlled by her husband. Her life, for all its luxuries, was still lived within a legal framework that treated her as a secondary citizen. Now, remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from our earlier adventures? We talked about how medieval people used some pretty strange things. Well, your lack of legal standing meant that even something as simple as a purchase could be complex. You couldn't just buy a cow on your own. Your husband would have to sign for it. You couldn't inherit land from your father directly. It would pass to your husband or your brother. Your life was a series of transactions and decisions made by men. The one exception to this rule was a widow. A widow, upon the death of her husband, often regained a measure of legal independence. She could own property, make contracts, and even represent herself in court. But, of course, this freedom only came at the cost of losing the one man who was legally bound to protect you. It's a bittersweet kind of independence, isn't it? So, you live your life as a legal shadow. Your identity and your rights completely tied to the man who rules your house. You're not a person, you're an accessory. A crucial and valuable one, but an accessory all the same. Your value is in your productivity, in your ability to produce heirs, and in your silent, tireless labor. The law, a concept designed to bring order, only serves to underscore your total lack of control. Alright, let's talk about the birds and the bees. Medieval style. But hold on, it's less about playful hummingbirds and more about, well, you'll see. Sex and reproduction in the Middle Ages were almost entirely divorced from the idea of pleasure. Your body, your sexuality, was not your own to explore or enjoy. It was a tool, a function, a means to an end. And that end was the production of children, specifically male heirs. The church, society, and your family all made it very clear that the purpose of intimacy within marriage was procreation. And anything else was a sin. It's not a very romantic picture, is it? The societal pressure to have children was immense. Infant and child mortality rates were so high that you might have to have 10 pregnancies just to see 3 children survive into adulthood. Each pregnancy, as we've already discussed, was a life-threatening ordeal. And yet, the expectation was that you would endure it over and over again. Mainstream historical fact: medieval women had an average of 7 to 8 pregnancies. A grueling cycle of conception, childbirth, and nursing that dominated their adult lives from their teens to their 40s. Your identity as a woman was inextricably linked to your fertility. And when it came to preventing pregnancy, the methods were a little out there. A quirky tidbit from this era is the folk remedies and superstitions used to either prevent or hasten conception. Some women would carry a weasel's testicle or a part of a frog's womb in a pouch around their neck as a form of contraception. Other cures for infertility included drinking a potion made from a sterile animal's urine or sleeping with a live badger under the bed. It's hard to imagine, but these were the desperate, often bizarre measures people resorted to in a world without modern medicine. The line between superstition and science was, to put it mildly, non-existent. The lack of control over your own body was a defining feature of your life. Historians still argue whether the Church's strict doctrines on sex were more about controlling female sexuality or if they were a form of moral guidance intended to create a stable social order. Was it a misogynistic way to keep women in their place? Or was it an attempt to curb the chaos of unwanted pregnancies and out-of-wedlock births in a time when there was no social safety net? It's a debate with no easy answers. But one thing is clear. Your body was considered a vessel for the future of your family, not a source of personal pleasure. You also had to contend with the taboos around menstruation, which was seen as a source of impurity. In some religious texts, women were considered unclean during their period and were not allowed to enter certain parts of the church. This further reinforced the idea that your natural bodily functions were something to be ashamed of. A healthy sex life, in our modern sense of the term, was not a concern. The focus was on duty, progeny, and survival. So, while we might talk about romantic love as a central theme of life, for you, it was a distant luxury. Your relationship with your husband was a partnership for survival and procreation. A grim reality that made the very idea of romance a fantasy. The brutal facts of biology and societal expectation meant that your body was never truly your own. In a world where sickness was a constant companion and hygiene was, shall we say, a bit of an afterthought, your health was in a state of perpetual jeopardy. For a medieval woman, a simple fever could be a death sentence, and a minor infection could lead to a slow, agonizing end. Medical knowledge was a bizarre blend of ancient Greek ideas, religious superstition, and folk remedies passed down from one generation to the next. You don't have a doctor to call, you have a village healer, a midwife, or perhaps a local monk who claims to have some knowledge of the human body. The treatments were often more brutal than the disease itself. A mainstream historical fact about medieval health is that the theory of the four humors dominated medical thought. This theory, inherited from the ancient Greeks, posited that the body was made up of four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was believed to be an imbalance of these humors, and the cure was to restore that balance. This often meant you were subjected to bloodletting, a popular but incredibly dangerous procedure where a healer would cut a vein to release what they believed was bad blood. Imagine having a fever, and your cure is to have a cut made in your arm, likely with an unsterilized knife, to let some blood drain out. Not exactly a relaxing spa day. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some of the home remedies that you might have been given were truly wild. For a toothache, you might be told to rub a live spider on your gums. To stop a cough, you might be given a potion made of boiled snails. For a headache, you might be instructed to apply a poultice of herbs and boiled mice to your forehead. And for a fever, you might be given a concoction of brewed herbs mixed with, let's just say, a variety of unpleasant things. This was the reality of healthcare for the average person. A gamble between doing nothing and a remedy that might make you even sicker. The line between medicine and magic was almost non-existent. Historians still argue whether these folk remedies were a form of practical knowledge, passed down through generations of trial and error, or if they were simply a series of superstitious beliefs with no real scientific basis. The truth is, some of the herbs used did have medicinal properties, but the methods of administration and the inclusion of bizarre ingredients often rendered them ineffective or even harmful. So while your mother or grandmother might have believed they were helping you, they were often just making a bad situation worse. As a woman, you faced a unique set of health risks. Childbirth, as we've already mentioned, was the most dangerous time of your life. But beyond that, you were constantly at risk of malnutrition, as your diet was often less varied than a man's. You were also more susceptible to things like anemia due to constant pregnancies and blood loss. Your life was a tightrope walk over a pit of disease and injury, with very little in the way of a safety net. And when you did fall, the cures were often as terrifying as the illnesses themselves. The world you lived in wasn't just brutal in its social structure, it was brutal in its very physical realities. Every cough, every ache, was a potential sign of your life coming to a painful, premature end. For a medieval woman, the church was an ever-present force, a dominant influence that shaped your life from birth to death. It was a double-edged sword, offering both a rigid framework of control and, for a lucky few, a path to a degree of independence. The church's teachings on women were, to put it mildly, complex and often contradictory. On the one hand, the Virgin Mary was venerated as a pure, divine figure, the ultimate example of womanhood. On the other hand, Eve, the original sinner who brought about the fall of man, was held up as a cautionary tale, a symbol of female weakness and temptation. You were expected to be pious, obedient, and humble, a reflection of Mary, while constantly battling the sinful nature of Eve. This duality defined your relationship with the spiritual world. You were encouraged to attend Mass, pray, and venerate saints, but your participation in the hierarchy of the church was almost non-existent. You could not be a priest, a cardinal, or a pope. You were a follower, a servant, a soul to be saved. Mainstream historical fact. The Catholic Church in the Middle Ages maintained a strict division of roles, with women excluded from holding positions of clerical power, reinforcing a patriarchal social structure that extended far beyond the walls of the church itself. But there was a quirky exception that offered a glimmer of hope. For some women, the convent provided a sanctuary and a form of empowerment. Remember we mentioned it briefly as a path to power? Let's dig a bit deeper. A convent was a place where you could escape the brutal cycle of childbirth, domestic labor, and forced marriage. It was a place where you could learn to read, write, and even study Latin. An abbess, the head of a convent, could wield immense power, managing large estates, overseeing finances, and acting as a spiritual and temporal leader. This was a position of authority that was almost unheard of for a woman outside of the royal court. Historians still argue whether the church, with its complex and often contradictory views on women, was a liberating force or a tool of oppression. Did the opportunities it offered, like the convent, represent a genuine path to autonomy? Or were they just a clever way to co-opt and control a segment of the female population? Was the emphasis on purity and piety a means of spiritual guidance or a way to enforce a strict, patriarchal code of conduct? The answer is probably a bit of both. For some women, the convent was a true calling, a place of peace and learning. For others, it was simply the best of a bad set of options, a place to be sent when they couldn't be married off. Your spiritual life was a source of comfort, a place to seek solace in a world of hardship. You would pray to saints, light candles, and hope for divine intervention in a life that was often beyond your control. You might even go on a pilgrimage, a rare chance to leave your village and see the wider world. A journey undertaken for spiritual salvation but also, perhaps, for a fleeting taste of adventure. The church gave you a sense of purpose and a place in a world that often treated you as an afterthought. It offered the promise of a better life in the next world. A small but powerful comfort for a life that was often brutal in this one. While the hearth and the home were your primary domain, a surprising number of women worked outside of the domestic sphere. This wasn't a matter of personal choice or ambition, it was a matter of sheer economic necessity. If your husband's income wasn't enough to feed the family, your labor was a critical part of the household economy. You weren't a stay-at-home mom, you were a contributing partner. A vital part of the family business, whatever that business might be. Mainstream historical fact. Women were involved in a wide range of trades and crafts in medieval towns and cities. You could find them working as brewers, bakers, weavers, spinners, and even in some forms of retail. They were often crucial to the success of family businesses, working alongside their husbands or fathers. For example, the brewing of ale was almost exclusively done by women, earning them the nickname alewives. It was a dirty, difficult job, but it was a consistent source of income for many households. The phrase, alewife, was a common one, and it represented a woman who was a key part of the local economy. There's a quirky tidbit here, too. While many women worked in their husbands' trades, some were able to establish their own small businesses. In London, there were records of women working as glovers, embroiderers, and even bookbinders. This wasn't a sign of widespread female empowerment. but rather a testament to the tenacity and skill of women who found a way to earn an independent living. I imagine the conversations between these women were less about social gossip and more about the price of wool or the quality of dyes. It was a no-nonsense, pragmatic approach to survival in a tough world. Historians still argue whether the work women did outside the home was seen as an extension of their domestic duties or a legitimate form of labor in its own right. Was a woman who brewed ale seen as a businesswoman, or was she just seen as a housewife who happened to make a product? The truth is, the line between domestic and professional labor was a lot blurrier than it is today. You didn't leave your house to go to work. Your work was often intertwined with your home life. You might brew ale in your kitchen and sell it from your front door. You might weave cloth in the corner of your living room and take it to the market on market day. The work you did wasn't just about making money, it was also about contributing to the family's survival. If you were a peasant, you'd be helping in the fields during the harvest, your back aching and your hands raw from the sun and the work. If you were in a town, you'd be a partner in your husband's business, helping with the accounts, the customers, and the production. Your labor was essential, but it was often undervalued and unseen. The great epic poems and historical chronicles of the time rarely mention the work of the everyday woman. But without her tireless labor, the whole system would have collapsed. So, while you might not have been a knight or a king, you were the silent, essential engine of the medieval economy. Let's narrow our focus now to the life of a peasant woman. The one you probably are. This is the life of the vast majority of medieval women. A sun-up to sundown existence defined by the rhythm of the seasons and the demands of the land. Your days are not just long, they are physically punishing. You are, in essence, an extension of the farm, and your body is a tool for its survival. Mainstream historical fact. Peasant women in the Middle Ages were an integral part of the agricultural workforce. They worked in the fields alongside men during planting and harvest, the two most critical times of the year. You'd be bent over, planting seeds in the spring, your back aching from the endless hours of stooping. You'd be in the field during the summer, weeding and tending to the crops. And come harvest time, you'd be wielding a sickle, cutting down grain in the sweltering heat. A task so grueling it would break a modern person in a matter of hours. There's a quirky tidbit that shows how deeply you were connected to the land. As a peasant, you would have an intimate, generational knowledge of the local landscape. You would know which wild herbs were good for medicine, which berries were safe to eat, and which roots were good for dyeing cloth. This was an unwritten, practical encyclopedia of the local world, passed down from mother to daughter. This knowledge was essential for the family's survival, a kind of primitive botany that was more important than any book learning. It's like being a walking, talking version of a medieval survival guide. Historians still argue whether the lack of formal social structure within peasant communities was a form of freedom or a cause of greater hardship. Did the absence of rigid class rules allow for more flexibility and equality within the family unit? Or did it simply mean that everyone, regardless of gender, was subjected to a life of brutal, unending labor? It's a good question. You might not have the gilded cage of a noblewoman, but you have the dirt and the toil of the fields. A different kind of imprisonment. Your life is a constant battle against the elements, against crop failure, against disease, and against the demands of the local lord, who expects his share of the harvest. You don't get to choose what you grow, and you don't get to keep all of what you produce. A significant portion of your labor is for someone else's benefit, and you are constantly on the verge of starvation. When the harvest fails, it is your family that goes hungry. When the winter is long and cold, it is your children who shiver. Your life is not a story of grand romance or political intrigue. It is a story of survival. A long, slow grind that ends, like it began, with a back aching from labor and hands calloused from work. Now, let's turn our attention to the other end of the social spectrum, the noblewoman. Her life is a world away from the peasant's dirt-floored hovel. But it is no less brutal, simply in a different way. You are a gilded cage, a beautiful object with a very specific purpose. Your hands are soft, but your life is constrained by a different set of rules. A rigid code of etiquette and expectation that can feel just as stifling as the labor in the fields. Your marriage, remember that? For you, a noblewoman, it's not just a transaction, it's a matter of international diplomacy. You are a pawn in a Game of Thrones, and your marriage is designed to secure a truce, solidify an alliance, or merge two powerful families. You will likely be married off as a young teenager, sent to live in a strange castle with a strange man you've never met, and expected to produce an heir. Your purpose is not to work the land, it's to perpetuate a lineage and ensure the future of your family's power. Mainstream historical fact: noblewomen were often married for political gain, with marriages being arranged when they were children, and the bride and groom often had no say in the matter. Your body is a vessel, and your wedding night is a contract being fulfilled. A quirky detail about a noblewoman's life is the importance of needlework. While it might seem like a quaint hobby, it was a central part of a noblewoman's education and social life. You would spend hours upon hours creating intricate tapestries, embroidering banners, and sewing beautiful garments. This wasn't just for fun, it was a way to display your piety, your patience, and your skill. A tapestry, for example, could tell a story, commemorate a battle, or display a family's coat of arms, and it was a public testament to your worth as a noblewoman. The act of sewing was a way to keep your hands busy and your mind focused. A quiet, almost meditative form of control in a life where you had very little of it. Historians still argue whether a noblewoman had more or less power than a peasant woman. A peasant woman had the freedom to work and a direct impact on the survival of her family. A noblewoman, on the other hand, had wealth and status, but was often a prisoner of her own class. Her every move scrutinized, her every decision made for her. Was a life of physical labor a better alternative to a life of emotional and social confinement? It's a question with no easy answer. A noblewoman might have servants to do the scrubbing and the cooking, but she was also expected to manage a large household, oversee finances, and host important guests. Her work was less physical, but her responsibilities were immense and often stressful. So, while you might not be toiling in the fields, your life is still one of duty and obligation. You are expected to be a perfect hostess, a pious wife, a fertile mother, and a skilled manager of a large and complex household. You can't just walk away. Your entire identity is tied to your family name and your husband's status. Your gilded cage might be beautiful, but it's still a cage. The brutal reality of your life is that for all your wealth and all your status, you are a tool in a larger game, and your happiness is a luxury you can't afford. In a world where you are a legal extension of your husband, there is one, and only one, event that can grant you a fleeting taste of independence: his death. Widowhood is a strange, bittersweet state. It's a time of mourning and grief, but it is also a time of surprising, and often unprecedented, freedom. For the first time in your life, you are not under the legal control of a father, a husband, or a brother. You are your own person, and that is a truly powerful, if sad, thing. Mainstream historical fact: a widow was the only medieval woman who could legally own property, make contracts, and represent herself in court without the consent of a man. This legal status, known as femme sole, was a radical departure from the coverture that defined your life as a married woman. Suddenly, the land that you and your husband owned is yours. The business you worked so hard to build is yours to run. You can make decisions for yourself, for your children, and for your future. It's the first and only time in your life you get to be the boss. There's a quirky tidbit here, too. A widow's newfound freedom was often accompanied by a curious social status. While she was free from a man's legal control, she was often seen as a potential source of land and wealth, and she could be a target for opportunistic suitors. I can only imagine how annoying it would be to be fending off men who see you not as a person, but as a walking, talking piece of property. A widow had to be strong, shrewd, and smart to navigate this new and dangerous world. It was a new kind of brutal, a mental and social struggle rather than a physical one. Historians still argue whether the legal rights granted to widows were a form of societal progress or just a pragmatic solution to a problem. Did society give women these rights out of a sense of fairness? Or was it simply the most efficient way to ensure that the family's wealth and property stayed intact and didn't get lost in a tangle of legal disputes? The answer, as is often the case, is probably somewhere in the middle. The system was designed to keep wealth within the family, but in doing so, it created a loophole that gave women a measure of power they wouldn't have otherwise had. Of course, not all widows were created equal. A peasant widow's freedom was still a life of backbreaking labor. She still had to work the land and feed her children. but she had the freedom to decide how that work would be done. A noble woman, on the other hand, had to be careful not to marry a man who would try to seize her family's lands. But for the first time, she had the power to say no. Widowhood, then, was a brutal kind of emancipation. It came at a terrible price. But it was the only way for a woman to gain legal personhood in a world that had so far denied her that basic right. You were finally a person, and not a thing, in a world where you are a legal shadow. The scales of justice are not tipped in your favor, they are thrown out the window entirely. If a woman was accused of a crime, she faced a legal system that was, at best, deeply biased and, at worst, designed to be stacked against her. Her lack of legal standing, her subordinate status, and the prevailing societal views about female morality all contributed to a harsher, less forgiving form of justice. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval law often treated women and men differently in a court of law. A woman's testimony was sometimes considered less valid than a man's, and she could be subjected to different, and often more brutal, forms of punishment. For example, a man might be fined for a crime, while a woman might be subjected to public shaming, a form of social punishment that could destroy her reputation and make her life impossible. The public pillory or the ducking stool were common punishments for women accused of gossiping or nagging, crimes that were seen as uniquely female. There's a quirky tidbit about this that just underscores the absurdity of the system. In some places, a woman accused of a crime could not be put to the rack or other forms of torture without her husband's consent. But, and here's the kicker, if her husband gave his consent, her torture would be carried out. So your supposed legal protection was just a formality. A cruel joke that put your life in the hands of the very man who was supposed to be your protector. It's like a twisted version of permission to torture. Historians still argue whether these harsher punishments for women were a way to maintain social order or a reflection of a deeper, more profound misogyny. Were these laws simply meant to keep women in line, to ensure their obedience and conformity? Or were they a form of retribution against a gender that was seen as inherently sinful and weak? The truth is, it was probably a combination of both. The laws were designed to keep the peace, but the methods used to enforce them were often cruel and misogynistic. A brutal reflection of how little value society placed on a woman's life and dignity. You were also at a disadvantage when it came to accusations of witchcraft. The witch craze was a later medieval phenomenon, but its roots are here. In a world that distrusted and feared female power, a woman who was a little too outspoken, a little too smart, or a little too skilled in folk medicine could be accused of witchcraft. Her word would be worth nothing against the testimony of a man, and her fate would be sealed. So while a man might be punished for a crime, you could be punished for who you were, a target for the fears and prejudices of a superstitious society. Your life was a precarious walk on a legal tightrope, with the slightest misstep leading to a brutal and unforgiving fall. And so, we come to the end of our journey. A long and brutal trek through the life of a medieval woman. But before we fade into sleep, we have to ask a final question. What is left of her? Where are her stories, her songs, her triumphs and her tragedies? The brutal truth is that very little of her legacy remains. She was not a king, a knight, or a cleric, and her life was not seen as worthy of being written down. Her stories were told in whispers around a hearth, a legacy passed down from mother to daughter, but they were not preserved in the great libraries of the world. Mainstream historical fact. The vast majority of historical records from the Middle Ages were written by men, for men, and focused on the lives of kings, nobles, and religious leaders. The lives of common people, and especially women, were rarely documented. Your existence, for all its hardship and endurance, was a footnote in a history that was not yours. Your name might appear on a tax roll or a legal document, but your story, your hopes, your fears, and your loves were lost to time. There's a quirky tidbit here that reminds us of the power of her influence. Even in the absence of written records, the very language we speak today is peppered with phrases and ideas that came from the daily lives of women. The word spinster, for example, originally meant a woman who spun wool for a living, a common and respectable trade. It was only much later that it came to mean an unmarried woman. The humble act of spinning, a life of repetitive labor, is now a word that carries a different kind of meaning, a reminder that her legacy, though invisible, is still with us. Historians still argue whether the lack of women's voices in historical records is an unrecoverable loss or if we can, through careful analysis of legal documents, household inventories, and other oblique sources, piece together a more accurate picture of their lives. It's a debate that highlights the difficulty of writing a history of a people who were, for all intents and purposes, invisible. Can we truly understand a world without hearing the voices of half its population? The answer is probably no. But we can, through careful work, try to imagine their lives, to give them a voice they were never allowed to have. And so, we must end not with a grand heroic tale, but with a quiet acknowledgement. The medieval woman was not a queen on a throne, but a quiet, powerful force. She was the one who kept the family alive, who raised the children, who tended to the sick, and who endured a life of hardship with a quiet, unshakable strength. She was not a legend, but she was real, and her life, though brutal, was filled with a purpose and a dignity that we can only now begin to understand. She is a shadow in our history, but a light in our imagination. Her story is a quiet one, a story of endurance, and it is a story that, in its own way, is just as epic as any told in a castle hall. Now, as the screen fades to black, and the sounds of the day grow distant, allow your mind to drift. You are safe in your bed, in your own time, a world away from the cold floors and smoky air we just visited. Let the quiet hum of the fan and the softness of your blankets be a comfort. The history we've explored is a heavy one, but it belongs to the past. It is a story told, a lesson learned. Your body is at rest. Your mind is easing into the stillness. The sounds of the world are fading, and all that's left is a gentle quiet. You are at peace, you are safe, and the night is yours. Sleep now.